Infinimist is one of Necromancer's all-time most iconic builds in Diablo 4, and it has finally come back in a big way in Season 4. This new version of the build does crazy single target damage, it gets way better uptime on Blood Mist, and everything about this build is just the peak version of what we've ever seen with Infinimist in the past. The corpse generation is absolutely insane, and the damage is crazy, the survivability is crazy, everything about this build is just phenomenal. You can see me destroying Uber Lilith. I've already done a pit 125. When that was first try, by the way, this build could easily go 130 plus, and you can see me absolutely annihilating 100s in speed. The build actually farms incredibly fast because of a few things we're going to talk about later, and because of its actually pretty good single target, it is an incredible farming build. So the build is really good for pushing, it is great for single target, and it's really good for farming. This is just an extremely strong build, and in fact I would go so far as to say it is one of Necromancer's best builds currently. An obvious comparison you're gonna want to know is how does this build compare to minions? Well, in terms of survivability, Infinimist takes that hand over fist. If you're like me playing minions and constantly frustrated with dying to just random one-shots you can't even see, this build is a fantastic alternative. Why is it so tanky, you might ask? Well, for starters, we're going to be getting around 100% uptime on Blood Mist, and we can go into Blood Mist whenever we want. If you're new to the Infinimist concept, that's where the namesake comes from, right? We're just getting infinite Blood Mist. And a lot of that is coming from the aspect of Explosive Mist, which is going to cause our Blood Mist to automatically cast Corpse Explosions, and for each Corpse Explosion it consumes, it's going to reduce Blood Mist cooldown. Where that becomes really powerful is when you pair that with Black River, which causes those Corpse Explosions to eat 5 corpses per cast. So we're able to get crazy uptime on Blood Mist, and on top of that, we're also able to run Harlequin for 20% damage reduction, Hardened Bones for 25%, and then coming into the skill tree, we're also able to run Standalone for 18% damage reduction. And you can see we have all these different sources of damage reduction, and we're also able to run 100% uptime on Blood Mist, so the survivability of this build is just incredible. Even outside of Blood Mist, this build is tankier than minions, and inside Blood Mist, it is way tankier. Now, something else with regards to tankiness that's very important were the buffs to Book of the Dead. All of our Book of the Dead things got buffed, which is partly what's taking this build from being good, but not meta, to actually being a viable meta build, was the buffs to the Book of the Dead in the most recent patch. And what I want to talk about first is the Blood Golem sacrifice. So you can see I am getting 23% maximum life from the Blood Golem sacrifice, and keep in mind that is being scaled by the buff Sacrificial, which is giving it a 50% increase. And what you're seeing in the Book of the Dead, by the way, is with Sacrificial. So I'm getting a total of 23% maximum life from the Blood Golem sacrifice. So compared to minions, way tankier, right? Way tankier. It's not even close. In terms of damage, actually in AoE, I think this build is genuinely competitive with minions. It's hard to tell because the variation of gear is so extreme. For example, the set I'm wearing right now, obviously my weapon is like crazy, but all the rest of my gear I maybe spent a couple hundred mil on, but my minion set I've spent about 10 bill on. That being said, in AoE situations, even this cheaper setup compared to my mage setup is doing similar damage, okay? Because for every enemy that we bring up, because of Hued Flesh, every single enemy is going to give us an increase in the number of corpses that we're generating, so our damage scales exponentially in AoE, because the more enemies there are, the more corpse explosions we get, and the more corpse explosions we get, each of those corpse explosions is hitting each minion proccing Hued Flesh, so we're getting more corpses, and you just get this exponential damage that goes absolutely off. So in AoE, this build is incredibly competitive with minions. Now in single target, minions probably do about, well, quite a bit more damage, to be frank. Minions do a lot more single target damage, but it is much harder to play minions against bosses because you're so much squishier, and because you have to be constantly paying attention to your mage position, and you have to be like locked in while you're playing. Whereas with this build, I can just walk up to the boss and just sit in Blood Mist until it's dead. I love this build. I think it's super fun to play. But overall, where I would rank this build is about an A tier build. You know, it's definitely not quite as good as minions, but dude, if you just want to chill and farm and blast everything, this is the build for you. So let's start talking about the itemization, let's talk about the skill tree, let's talk about the Paragon board, and then we're going to talk about some of the things I figured out, because this build's actually a little more in-depth than you might think at first. So let's start by talking about items. As we get into itemization, there's two very important things to keep in mind. The first is one of the main goals of this build, which is to get 100% uptime on Army of the Dead. And in fact, for reasons we're going to talk about later, you actually want slightly more than 100% uptime on Army of the Dead. But this is going to make cooldown reduction incredibly important. Now, the second thing that we need to talk about, and this is an extremely important part of the build, and it's part of the reason why you're seeing dot builds perform so well, which is the Wither Legendary Paragon node. This Paragon Node gives you an exponential damage scaling based on the amount of intelligence you have. The reason why this is exponential is because for every point of intelligence, you have an increased chance to crit with dots, and you're increasing the crit damage. So it's going from linear to exponential because it's double dipping. So intelligence, extremely important. Cooldown reduction, incredibly important. Starting with Harlequin. Now, ideally, you would triple Masterwork cooldown reduction, but you can see I didn't even hit it once. But I am still running it because it's still amazing. On the chest piece, you definitely want Int because of what we discussed before with Wither, and then Maximum Life for survivability, and then Corpse Explosion ranks for the massive damage increase. And then we're going to be running the Aspect of Heart and Bones on our chest piece. Ideally, you would Masterwork fully the ranks of Corpse Explosion here. On our gloves, we really want, honestly, for gloves, you almost want triple GA gloves, to be honest with you, because intelligence is insanely strong because the Wither, damage over time, double dips, and then lucky hit chance is crazy. I'm definitely, ideally, you would get GA lucky hit chance, and then GA intelligence, and if you can, also get GA damage over time. And then I think what you would want to do is you would want to triple Masterwork lucky hit chance. And then we are running the sacrificial aspect here for the double dip on the Book of the Dead, where we're increasing the Book of the Dead by 50%. And there's, by the way, sacrificial is really strong. So this is doing 50%. And what's interesting, okay, Memento Mori increases Skeletal Warrior and Skeletal Mage sacrifice by 60%. So what is actually happening is that this is getting buffed by 60% from Memento Mori, and then it's getting multiplied again by Sacrificial. And so Sacrificial and Memento Mori actually multiply together to give it ginormous value. So this is really strong. And by the way, for temperings, just check out the build link below, and you can see all the temperings. But on our pants, we're looking for GA Intelligence, and then we want Max Life and Armor. And then I'm also, keep in mind, I'm GAing Armor on my pants here just to get to Armor Cap. And then for the Aspect, we're running the Aspect of the Embalmer. So 100% uptime on Army of the Dead means we're generating a ton of corpses, right? Plus we have all the ranks of Hewed Flesh, and we have all the lucky hit chance. That's why we want lucky hit chance so badly, is to increase the proc chance of Hewed Flesh. And this is particularly important in single target, okay? Lucky hit chance will, like, literally exponentially scale your damage in single target. It is a massive multiplier. And I know I'm saying the word exponential a lot, but it's all true, okay? This build has so many areas where it exponentially scales with damage. It is incredible. So, Embalmer. Tons of corpses that we're generating. Every time we eat corpses, which remember Black River, we're eating corpses 5 at a time, we're going to be getting blood orbs. And then we're running the aspect of Fast Blood, which is every time we pick up a blood orb, reduce the cooldown of our ultimate. And that's how we get 100% uptime on our ultimate, even in single target. We're also, of course, running Decrepify, and we're running an incredible amount of cooldown reduction. I'm running over 50% cooldown reduction right now. So my Army of the Dead is starting from 1 minute all the way down to 29 seconds. Then we're getting tons of Decrepify procs, and then we're just picking up blood orbs for the remaining cooldown. And that's how you get such crazy uptime. On our boots, you definitely want GA corpse skills, and then again, boots is another item where you would ideally get triple GA, okay? Because movement speed is super important, intelligence is super important. And then I am running the aspect of Explosive Mist. And you might have noticed I'm running Explosive Mist and Sacrilege, which might seem weird, but you literally generate enough corpses. You can eat 10 corpses a second, and in AoE, that's good. In fact, actually eating 10 corpses a second is sometimes too slow in AoE, and it's better to manually cast Corpse Explosion. But we're going to talk about that. Weapon, okay? Black River. There's this ideally 4 GA, okay? I'm not even going to lie. Well, no, okay. I'll be a little bit more accurate. Ideally, it's 3 GA, which is Intelligence, Corpse Skills, and Hewed Flesh. Hewed Flesh is by far the most important, and then Corpse Skills, and then Intelligence. And you also really want a good roll on the secondary. So, it is what it is. Obviously, this Black River is absurdly expensive, but that's what you want. You really want a GA Hewed Flesh. And then on the necklace, percent intelligence, cooldown reduction, 2 very important, right? We definitely want, ideally you would have a G8 intelligence, okay? Because of the Wither node, a G8 intelligence, right? This is just percentage is incredibly good. And also, by the way, you probably noticed we're running Topaz in our gear, and that's how you get so much intelligence, right? And then you scale this with the amulet, and then you can see I'm currently running amplified damage. Now, ideally, that amplified damage would actually be Gloom, because Gloom is slightly better. By like 2% per point, so I'm missing like 8% damage because I have Amplify instead of Gloom, but it's still pretty good. And then on that, we're running the Blighted aspect for 180% damage. On our ring, we're running Intelligence, max life, which by the way, I think this max life should probably be damage over time. The thing is, my life pool is kind of low because I'm not running rubies. So you can kind of go back and forth. That max life roll should either be damage over time or maximum life, depending on if you want more survivability or more damage. And then you want a GA'd lucky hit chance roll. That's super, super important. And so, yeah, this ring's pretty good. And then obviously we're running fast blood on it. And then sacrilege. Okay, so sacrilege, you want lucky hit chance GA'd, and you want a minimum roll on the secondary. It needs to be 1 second for corpse explosions. And then once you have all that, ideally you would get GA corpse explosion or corpse skills, and then GA max life if you really got the gold. On our offhand, okay, this is another big piece of the build, and my offhand's a bit off, unfortunately. Your offhand, you definitely want lucky hit chance, and you definitely want intelligence, and ideally those two things would be G8, and then you also definitely want cooldown reduction. So you have. And this is an item where you almost want it to be 3G8. Again, I don't want to I want to express again that we have so many sources of exponential damage. Stats are so important. Luckily, the gear for this build is really cheap. But ideally, yeah, you really want GA lucky hit chance first, and then GA intelligence, then GA cooldown reduction. And we're running aspect of the damned, which is going to give us a 50% damage multiplier. Now, you probably are looking at my tempering on this thing and saying, what? 40% chance to deal poison damage? Why are you even playing that? The answer is that there is no good weapon tempering for this build. There just isn't a good weapon tempering, so I just slapped one on. Better than nothing, right? I mean, ideally it would be Shadow, but whatever, right? It's not doing anything anyway. So that's pretty much the gear. And remember, most important thing is to get to armor cap, which is 9230, and then also get to intelligence, or to resistance cap. Luckily, resistance cap is really easy because we have so much intelligence, but those should be your two priorities with gear. It doesn't matter exactly where your armor rolls are, just get them. So next, let's talk about the Book of the Dead, because it got buffed and it's really strong now. We're sacrificing Reapers for a massive 30% damage multiplier, sacrificing Mages for another 30% multiplier, and then we're sacrificing the Golem for 23% max life. And you can see, pretty freaking strong Book of the Dead, right? And Sacrificial is putting in huge work in this case. Next, we're going to talk about the skill tree, and then we're going to talk about the Paragon board, and then lastly, we're going to talk about how to play the build. And we're going to talk about all this other stuff before we talk about how to play it, so you can have the full context of what's going on, because the build's a bit weird. It's not a traditional Infinimist build, and it's also, Infinimist is just inherently so different from other builds. So for our basic skill, it doesn't matter, we're just skipping it. Then we're taking Blight with Supernatural Blight. Now, this is a 20% multiplier, which is really good. It's going to help stack the Blighted aspect for the 120% damage multiplier. That's all great. But then this is also going to generate a ton of corpses. I actually spam Blight and single target whenever I'm outside of the Blighted window to generate more corpses to make sure that whenever I corpse explosion, I have 20 corpses on the ground when I go into Blighted. And don't worry, we're going to talk about all of that more later, but Blight is really good. Of course, 3 ranks into Hued Flesh because super important. 1 point into Blood Mist because we're getting +4 from the Harlequin, which puts us at 5. And remember, you don't really want to go above 5. And then Ghastly Blood Mist for the corpse generation. 30 ranks of Corpse Explosion, and then we are also running the Blinded Corpse Explosion to turn into damage over time. 1 point into Grim Harvest. This is actually really useful because it gives you infinite essence, because, we're generating so many corpses and we're eating them 5 at a time. Then 3 points into Fueled by Death for the damage multiplier. 3 points in Death's Embrace for the movement speed. 3 points in Death's Approach for the movement speed. 3 points into Death's Embrace for the damage. 3 points to Amplified Damage for the extra damage. And again, big damage multipliers, right? Death's Embrace is really good. Amplified Damage is really good. And it's giving us survivability. Then we also have Decrepify, which is giving us 24% damage reduction, which is really strong. And then we're also getting the cooldown reduction from Decrepify, which is, again, really good. Because we have a ton of lucky hits, so we're getting tons of procs of this. And on top of that, this is because we have so many corpse explosions out at a time, and each ticket the corpse explosion has a chance to proc this. And that applies to all lucky hit, by the way. So like with Blight as well as corpse explosion, for example, like 1 corpse explosion can proc Hued Flesh twice. Same with 1 Blight can proc Hued Flesh twice. And all lucky hit can be procced multiple times. And this changes from season to season, by the way. So it's important to know that that's how it's working this season. Then we're running Corpse Tendrils with Plague Corpse Tendrils. This is our source of vulnerable. 3 points in a Reaper's Pursuit for the movement speed, then 3 points in Gloom, and 3 points in Terror for the damage multipliers, and then 3 points into Crippling Darkness, because this is going to actually massively increase the speed that we stagger bosses, which is pretty important, okay, because of Terror. So, especially when you're doing speeds, you really want to get a boss stagger fast so that you can delete the boss from existence. Then we're running Army of the Dead with Prime Army of the Dead for that ridiculous corpse generation. I think this is about 3 corpses a second. And what's also cool about this, by the way, is the lucky hit chance is 91%. So that's a lot of lucky hit chance. So this is also proccing Hued Flesh and Decrepify and everything else. So Army of the Dead is really good. 3 points to standalone for the damage reduction, 3 points of Momentum Warrior for the damage multipliers, and then 1 point into Shadow Blight, purely to proc the Shadow Blight aspect. This is not at all, the damage from this doesn't matter, we just run this to proc Blighted. Now, couple of interesting things about Paragon. The first one is Gravekeeper, which at first doesn't make sense, because you're like, yeah, we're generating a ton of corpses, but aren't we eating them all? Well, a very important property of Corpse Explosion is that whenever you cast Corpse Explosion, it snapshots, okay? What that means is if you have 5 corpses and you cast Corpse Explosion, it's going to snapshot with the full Gravekeeper buff, and this applies to Blighted and everything else as well, by the way. So that's why we're running Gravekeeper. It's really good. Excavation, this is where all of our Fortify is coming from, really good. Wither, we already talked about, super important. And then Scent of Death, ideally, you would be generally getting the 15% damage, but remember, because of this, of the amount of corpse generation we have, this is usually going to be the damage reduction, but it'll sometimes be damage, which is pretty nice. And then we have Sacrificial for 10% damage. Now, Abyssal is going to give us another 10% multiplier, but coming over here, where is it? So we got Control as well for the 20% multiplier, and then there it is, Flesh Eater. So Flesh Eater is incredibly good in this build, because remember, Black River is going to cause us to eat 5 corpses at a time, which means we get 100% uptime on Flesh Eater, which is really strong. And the last thing I want to mention is the Blood Begets Blood, because this also got buffed, which is whenever we pick up a Blood Orb, we get a stacking buff up to a 30% damage multiplier, which is pretty wild. So now, let's go to the target dummy and start talking about how this build is played, because it's a little bit weird compared to what you might expect. So this build's rotation is actually quite a bit different depending on if you're in single target or AoE. So let's start with AoE because it's really simple. All we want to do is we just want to walk up with Decrepify, right? So we want to Decrepify them, then we want to cast Army of the Dead, we cast a Blight, and then we just go in Blood Mist. And we sit in Blood Mist, we do this whole ramp, then as soon as we're out of Blood Mist, we cast Corpse Centrals, throw out another Blight, Curse again, refresh Army of the Dead, and then go back into Blood Mist. And you can see my outside on Army of the Dead is absolutely ridiculous, but the main idea here is we just want to be constantly going back into Blood Mist, like, as soon as we can, ideally. But there is a caveat to this, okay? An important caveat is that you actually get more cast of Corpse Explosions per second if you're sitting outside of Blood Mist manually casting them, compared to if you're in the Blood Mist casting them with Explosive Mist. So, in general, try to be outside of the Blood Mist manually casting, but if you need to, you can go into Blood Mist and cast it that way. And you can see, by the way, like, look at how many hundreds of millions of damage we're doing. And this is, like, I mean, this build is just crazy. And this is nowhere near the peak. But you can see, like, you see some 120 mils. So, pretty good, right? 120 million damage every half a second to every mob is pretty nice. So, in single target, it's going to look kind of similar, but it's also going to be very different. So, we're going to walk up. We're still going to Decrepify, Blight, AoD, and then we're going to go into Blood Mist. And this is at the very start of the fight to get the corpses out. Then, as soon as Blood Mist is over, we're going to do the same thing where we refresh everything. So, at first, it seems pretty similar, but there's a couple of very key differences. The first key difference is that you need to make sure that you're walking around picking up Blood Orbs. Because if you're not picking up Blood Orbs, your Army of the Dead will not reset. And, you know, obviously you can move in Blood Mist, which is really nice. And if you see your Army of the Dead is about to end, cancel your Blood Mist and recast Army of the Dead, okay? Don't just sit in Blood Mist permanently. And the second thing we're going to talk about is going to make it even more important to not just sit inside of Blood Mist, okay? So, everything's pretty similar. Just keep up all your buffs, keep up Army of the Dead, do your thing. Now, once you get used to this and you get really familiar and comfortable, there's one more thing you need to start paying attention to, which is your Blighted stacks, okay? Remember, your Corpse Explosion snapshot, right? So whenever they're casted, they're going to have, if you have Blighted, they're going to have the Blighted for the whole duration. If you don't have Blighted, then they will never get Blighted, even if you get it while the Corpse Explosion is out. So what that means, you actually want to ramp and wait and generate as many corpses as you can, then eat all the corpses once you have Blighted. Okay, and remember, you're capped at 20 corpses, so you can't ramp infinitely. And of course, your Sacrilege is going to keep eating corpses regularly, but your corpse generation is actually higher than what Sacrilege can eat. And then, as soon as you get to 10 stacks, you go into like Blood Mist or whatever, or you just start manually casting Corpse Explosions and eat all the corpses. So it's kind of weird, but you'll get used to it, right? Overall, the rotation are pretty much the same. Just keep up Decrepify, keep up Blight, keep up AO the D, and cast Corpse Controls on cooldown. So that's the build, guys. I love this build. I think it's so fun to play. I've been having an absolute blast with it. I hope you guys like it too. And yeah, that's all I got for you. See you in the next video. Peace.